One underlying current in the text and the lecture so far has been this duality of potential data that theorists can draw upon in their attempts to categorize and operationalize ontological frameworks and to refine them into more systematic treatments of a particular domain, like the mental domain, the physical domain, or their interactions. On the one hand, there is this stream of empirical observation that we find in anatomy and physiology. In the early modules of this lecture, we see the beginnings of the attempt to integrate these two streams together into a set of experimental techniques and operationalizations for the systematic investigation of mental phenomena. We begin with a more or less objective empirical observation of reaction times, and we see how that then gets extended into psychophysics and then into mental chronometry. In this module, we're going to turn our attention to introspection and introspection-based psychologies, the first real attempts at experimental psychology, and in particular, experimental psychology that relies heavily on this second stream of data, this introspective data. We'll look at the original introspective psychologist Wundt and his brand of introspectionist psychology, voluntarism. Then we'll turn our attention to one of his students, Titchener, who moves to America and Cornell and founds the structuralist version of introspectionist psychology. And we'll end by looking at Brentano and ACT psychology. When we're done looking at these particular instances of introspectionist psychology, we'll talk a little bit about the strengths and the weaknesses of the way in which they attempt to utilize introspection and how it ultimately leads to the downfall of the school of psychology and propagates suspicion regarding the use of introspective data in serious empirical psychology. Let's begin our consideration of voluntarism and Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt was a German physician, psychologist, and physiologist, as well as a university professor. He founded the first real laboratory explicitly dedicated to psychological research at the University of Leipzig in 1879. He likewise began the first journal for psychological research in 1881 and published one of the most widely used textbooks of the time. If Freud is the father of psychiatry, Wundt is likely the father of experimental psychology. Wundt studies under Mueller and Helmholtz, and he follows his first book, Contributions to the Theory of Sense Perception, with a second, Lectures on Human and Animal Psychology. Wundt equates mentality with consciousness, holding that experimentation helps one to understand simpler conscious phenomenon, but not more complex phenomenon like reasoning. Essentially, Wundt's going to limit psychology to studying emotions, as well as what we nowadays call sensation and perception. On Wundt's view, you have to employ historical analysis and naturalistic read non-experimental observation in order to understand higher mental functioning. Thus, we find Wundt adopting a categorization of mentality based upon conscious experience. He further divides that domain into scientifically tractable phenomenon like feelings and sensation, and scientifically intractable phenomenon like higher order mental functioning. Wundt is going to want to study perception, the passive and involuntary process of combining multiple sensations, and apperception, active voluntary perception involving attention. Wundt seeks the fundamental elements of conscious mentality and the rules by which those elements combine into more complex experiences. Wundt wants to adopt the mental chemistry model of the mind that we first encountered in the British empiricists. However, for Wundt, attention and the will act as a sort of metaphorical catalyst, making apperception active. He differentiates himself from the British empiricists then in part because of his introduction of this active volitional component to the mental chemistry account. We'll continue our discussion of Wundt and voluntarism in the next lecture module.